The wagon trail into Blackstone Reach was little more than two ruts pressed into cracked earth by years of wheels and hooves and hard luck. Mara Quinn followed it the way she followed most things in her life, with her jaw set, her eyes forward, and no particular feelings about where it led. She was 34 years old and looked it, not in a ruined way, but in the way of a woman who had spent her life working outdoors and didn't have the time or the patience to pretend otherwise. Her hands were rough. There was a scar along her left forearm from a grease fire in a mining camp outside of Del Ridge 3 years back. Her dark hair was pinned up under a worn hat that had started out belonging to someone else, and she'd never bothered to find out whose. She had $2.60 in her coat pocket, enough to get her to the next town, maybe buy a meal she didn't have to cook herself, and find whoever was willing to pay her to cook theirs. That was the whole of her financial plan, and she had been operating on variations of it for the better part of a decade. The telegram had found her in Orvid's trading post, a half general store, half everything else kind of place at the crossroads south of Copper Hill. The man behind the counter had handed it to her along with her change for a tin of tobacco she didn't smoke but could sometimes trade for things she needed. Cook needed. One night, good pay. Boone Ranch, Blackstone Reach. Silas Boone. She'd read it twice. Good pay were the words that did it. Not fair pay or decent pay, but good. Men who used the word good in a telegram were either desperate or dishonest, and either way, she could work with that. She'd asked the counterman about Blackstone Reach. He'd looked at her the way people looked at you when they were deciding how much of the truth you could handle. "It's about 12 miles northeast," he said finally. "Boone Ranch has been out there going on 40 years. Silas Boone runs it now, or tries to." Something wrong with the place? He'd gone back to counting his inventory without meeting her eyes. Nothing wrong with the land. That was answer enough. The ranch came into view around mid-afternoon, and Mara's first thought was that whoever had built it had done so with real intention. The main house was 2 stories, weathered gray-brown by years of sun and wind, but the bones were good. Solid foundation, covered porch that ran the full length of the front, a stone chimney that looked like it meant business. There was a barn that had seen better days, 3 smaller outbuildings, a chicken coop, and a kitchen garden that had gone badly to weed. A windmill stood at the east side of the property, spinning in the hot, dry wind with a squeal that you could probably hear from a mile off. What struck her wasn't what was wrong with the place. It was how quiet it was. A ranch this size should have been full of noise. Animals, workers, somebody doing something. Instead, the yard was mostly still. A few chickens pecked half-heartedly in the dirt. A dog lifted its head from the porch steps as she rode up, looked at her with profound disinterest, and put its head back down. She tied her horse at the post and climbed down, working the stiffness out of her knees. The front door opened before she got to the steps. The boy who appeared in the doorway was maybe 15, with the kind of face that was trying very hard to look older than it was. He had dark eyes and a jaw set at an angle that she recognized. That particular way of holding yourself when you were expecting trouble and had learned that showing it was worse than hiding it. "You the cook?" he asked. "I'm Mara Quinn," she said. "I got a telegram from Silas Boone." "He's in the barn." The boy looked her over with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not unfriendly exactly, but careful. "I'm Callum. Come in if you want. I'll get him." She stepped inside. The front room of the house was large and had once been, she suspected, well kept. The furniture was good quality and old. A solid oak table, chairs that matched, a sideboard with glass doors. But there was that particular brand of disorder that came not from laziness but from too many people and not enough hands to manage them. A coat on the floor that hadn't been picked up. Dishes stacked but not washed. The smell of something that had burned on the stove, maybe yesterday, maybe 2 days ago. On the stairs sat 3 boys in descending order of height, watching her the way wild animals watch things they weren't sure about, with total stillness and complete attention. The middle one had a split lip that was healing yellow-green. The smallest was wearing 1 boot. "Where's the other boot?" Mara asked before she could stop herself. The smallest boy blinked. "Don't know?" She set her bag down by the door and looked around the room. "You boys eaten today?" The 3 of them exchanged a look, one of those sibling looks that communicated a whole conversation in about a second and a half. "We had biscuits," said the one with the split lip. in the tone of someone defending a position they knew was weak. "This morning?" "I cheat." "Yes, ma'am." Mara turned toward the kitchen. What? She had the fire going and water set to boil when she heard the back door and boots on the floorboards. She didn't turn around. "You'd be Mara Quinn," said a voice behind her, "and you'd be Silas Boone." She kept her attention on what she was doing: salt pork from the larder, dried beans soaking in the pot, cornmeal she'd found in a tin that was nearly empty. "Your boys haven't eaten since morning. Do you have more cornmeal than this?" A pause. "There should be another tin in the cellar. Go get it." She finally turned. He was taller than she'd expected and thinner, maybe 40, maybe younger than that. It was hard to tell because grief did things to people's faces that added years that weren't really there. He had a rancher's hands and a rancher's posture, that particular combination of physical strength and bone-deep exhaustion that she'd seen in men who worked land for a living. His eyes were dark, like Callum's, and they had the same careful quality, watching her with an assessment that wasn't hostile but wasn't warm either. He also looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in several months. "You don't waste time," he said. "I cook, Mr. Boone. That's what you're paying me for." She turned back to the fire. "Cellar, please." He went. When he came back with the cornmeal tin, she heard him stop behind her for a moment, just standing there, like he was trying to figure out what to say. She'd cooked in enough households to recognize that pause. It meant there was something he needed to explain and didn't know how to start. "The telegram said one night," she said, to make it easier for him. "What's the situation?" He set the tin on the table and leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, not defensive, just the habit of a man holding himself together. "I've got 7 boys. Oldest is Callum, 15. Youngest is Pem. He just turned 5. My wife, Clara." He stopped, jaw worked. "She passed 8 months ago. Fever took her in 4 days. I've been trying to manage the ranch and the boys both, and the truth is, I'm doing a poor job of either." Mara kept her eyes on the fire. She'd learned a long time ago that men told you things faster if you didn't look at them directly. "I've got a buyer coming through in 2 days," Silas continued. "A cattle broker out of Millhaven, fellow named Garrett. If I can feed him a decent meal, there's a chance he'll agree to terms on the herd. If I don't land this deal—" He paused again. "It matters, is what I'm saying. How long since you've had anyone cooking for you?" "My daughter-in-law, Callum's wife, if you can believe it. They married young. She was helping some. She's expecting now, and I sent her back to her mother's family in Copperfield a month ago. Since then, it's been whatever the boys and I can manage." A dry, humorless sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Which isn't much." Mara thought about $2.60 in her coat pocket. She thought about the road to the next town and the telegram that had said good pay. "For the broker's meal," she said. "What are you prepared to offer?" $3, Silas said. "For tonight and tomorrow, through the dinner." $3. That was nearly 2 weeks of careful living. She didn't hesitate for long. "Agreed. I'll stay through the dinner tomorrow evening. After that, I ride on." "Understood." He pushed off the counter. "I'll see to the animals. Callum can show you where things are." He went out, and she listened to the back door close, and then she was alone in the kitchen with the fire and the soaking beans and the distant sound of 7 boys in a house that had too many rooms and not enough mother. Dinner that night was beans and cornbread and salt pork, and it was nowhere near fancy, but it was hot, and there was enough of it. The boys came to the table in stages, Callum first, then 3 more who introduced themselves in a rush, as Hale, Dodd, and Fergus, ranging from 13 down to 9. Then 2 smaller ones, Theo and Jeb, 7 and 6, who came in trailing each other like they were attached. And finally Pem, 5 years old and wearing, she noticed, 1 boot and 1 bare foot. "Found the other boot?" she asked him. Pem looked at his feet like he'd forgotten the situation. "Not yet. After dinner we look for it." He climbed into his chair and picked up his spoon with great seriousness. The table was noisy in the way that tables with 7 children always were, talking over each other, elbowing for the cornbread, an argument between Dodd and Fergus about something that had happened in the barn that afternoon. Silas sat at the head of the table and ate without joining in, which Mara suspected was his habit. His silence wasn't cold exactly, more like he was present in body, but somewhere else in his head, watching his children from a great distance he didn't know how to cross. Callum watched his father the way the oldest child in a struggling family always watched the parent, with a vigilance that had no business living in a 15-year-old's eyes. "This is good," said Hale, around a mouthful of cornbread. He was 13 and had the round-cheeked look of a boy who hadn't quite grown into the big feelings he was carrying. "Better than what Callum makes." "Callum's been doing the cooking?" Mara asked. "Someone has to," Callum said, without defensiveness. "He burned the eggs 3 times last week," said Dodd. "You burned them twice." "Boys," said Silas. Not loud. Just that one word, and the table quieted. Mara ate. She watched. She had cooked for enough families to read a household like a book, and what she was reading here had several chapters that were in serious trouble. Callum was carrying too much and resenting it, and trying not to resent it because he loved these brothers, and that love was the only thing keeping him from buckling. Silas was present but drowning, going through the motions of being a father while grief sat on his chest and wouldn't move. The younger boys were doing what children did, adapting, getting loud, getting quiet, pressing against the shape of the household to figure out what it would and wouldn't hold. It was none of her business. She was here for 2 days, $3, and then the road south. After the dishes were done, she washed, Callum dried without being asked, and she noted that. She went with Pem to look for the missing boot. They found it behind the woodpile on the east side of the house, which Pem seemed unsurprised by. "How'd it get there?" Mara asked. "Jeb threw it," Pem said, with the philosophical acceptance of a youngest child who has made his peace with the world. "Did he say why?" "He mostly doesn't." She handed the boot over. Pem sat down on the ground right there in the yard and pulled it on, working at the laces with his small, serious hands. The sun was going down and the sky over Blackstone Reach was doing that thing it sometimes did in open country, turning every shade of orange and red and deep bruised purple, vast and indifferent and oddly beautiful. "Did you know our mama?" Pem asked, not looking up from his boot. "No," Mara said. "I never met her. She was real good at cooking, too." He got one lace tied and started on the other. "Papa said she could make anything taste good, even the bad stuff." Mara looked at the sunset. "Even the bad stuff is a useful skill," she said. Pem finished tying his boot and looked up at her, satisfied. "Are you going to stay?" "I'm leaving day after tomorrow." He considered this with the gravity of a 5-year-old measuring something beyond his years. "Oh," he said, and then simply, "Okay." But the way he said it, that small, flat okay that held no surprise and no argument, settled somewhere in her chest in a way she didn't care for. She slept in the small room off the kitchen, which had probably been a housekeeper's room at some point. The mattress was acceptable. She lay on her back in the dark and listened to the windmill's distant squeal and told herself, 2 days, $3, you've stayed in harder places for less. Both of those things were true. She slept. Bound. The next morning she was up before the sun, which was habit. She built the fire back up and was working on breakfast. Eggs from the coop, the last of the bacon, a proper pan of biscuits, when Callum appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed. "You don't have to do all of that," he said. "I know." She didn't stop. "Go wake your brothers." He lingered in the doorway. "Miss Quinn." She looked at him. "The broker who's coming tomorrow," Callum said. "His name is Eli Garrett. He came through once before, about 2 years ago, when Mama was still—" He stopped, jaw tightening in that way she'd seen on his father's face. "He made an offer on the cattle then, and Papa didn't take it. This time—" He stopped again. "I know my father said the deal matters. I just want you to know that it matters more than he probably told you." Mara looked at him steadily. "How much more?" Callum's jaw worked. He was 15 years old and trying very hard to be 30. "We're behind on the land note, 3 months. The bank in Millhaven has sent 2 letters already. If we can't sell the herd at fair price, there won't be a next season." She held his gaze. "Does your father know you know this?" "He'd rather I didn't." A tired, almost adult half-smile crossed his face and vanished. "But someone has to." She turned back to the biscuits. "Go wake your brothers," she said again. After a moment, she heard him go. The morning moved the way mornings on working ranches always moved, a controlled chaos of chores and noise and small disasters. 2 of the younger boys, Theo and Jeb, got into a real argument by the water pump that ended with both of them muddy and Jeb sporting a new scrape on his elbow. Dodd and Fergus were sent to mend the fence line on the south pasture and came back 20 minutes later claiming they'd done it, which Mara sincerely doubted. Hale was supposed to be collecting eggs and managed to break 4 of them on the way back from the coop. Silas moved through all of it with the focused, deliberate energy of a man doing triage, fixing the most urgent thing and moving to the next and never quite catching up. He directed the boys, checked on the cattle, did something to the windmill that reduced its squeal by half. He worked hard. That much was clear. But there was a mechanical quality to it, like a man performing a role he'd been handed without quite feeling it from the inside. Around midday, he came into the kitchen and poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the window. "Broker gets here tomorrow mid-morning," he said. "I was thinking a roast, if you could manage it. There's a good cut in the cold box." "I can manage it," she said. She was working on a pie, dried apple, from the last jar on the pantry shelf. "What does he know about the state of the herd?" Silas looked at her sideways. "What do you mean?" "I mean, is he expecting to buy 50 cattle or 30? She kept her eyes on the dough. "Because if it's 50, he's going to notice when there are 30. A silence. Long enough that she looked up. Silas set his coffee cup down. The expression on his face was not quite shame and not quite anger, somewhere in between. That place where a proud man sat when he'd been forced to see something he'd been avoiding. "It's closer to 28. Mara said nothing. "I lost 7 over the winter to a sickness," he said, "and 5 more in the spring because the north fence went down and they wandered onto the Hendricks property, and Hendricks..." His jaw clenched. "There's a dispute. The cattle are in county custody pending judgment. So you need to sell 28 animals at a price that accounts for what the 50 would have brought." Essentially, she went back to the dough. "Then tomorrow's dinner better be very good." She heard something from him, a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite anything else. When she glanced up, he was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not warmth exactly. More like the specific look of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to have someone in the room who dealt in plain facts without flinching. "Miss Quinn," he said, "I appreciate what you're doing here." "You're paying me," she said. "Even so." She put the pie in the oven and started on the roast preparation and didn't say anything else about it. That afternoon, she found the boys' attempts at a kitchen garden and stood at the fence for a long moment looking at what might have been, under better circumstances, a decent plot of ground. The soil was good. She could see that. But it hadn't been tended in weeks, maybe months. Weeds had come up through the bean rows. The tomato plants had gone leggy and were falling sideways against their sticks without anyone to tie them back. She knew she was leaving tomorrow. She went and got the garden tools from the shed anyway. She was on her knees pulling weeds when she heard boots on the ground behind her and looked up to find 4 of the boys standing in a loose cluster, Hale, Dodd, Fergus, and Theo, watching her with an expression that was difficult to name. "What are you doing?" Hale asked. "What does it look like?" "But you're leaving tomorrow." "Correct." She pulled another handful of weeds by the root and tossed them in the bucket. "You can watch, or you can help. Watching is fine too, but it's less interesting." There was a short conference conducted entirely in glances. Then Dodd got down and started pulling weeds 2 feet away from her, with the aggressive enthusiasm of a boy doing something he'd decided to commit to. One by one, the others followed. They worked for an hour without much talking. The sun was hot, and the work was straightforward, and the kind of satisfaction that came from clearing something overgrown and revealing the order underneath it was a particular satisfaction that translated across age and temperament. By the end, the bean rows were clear, and the tomato plants were tied back, and the whole garden looked like something that might actually grow into food again. Fergus sat back on his heels and looked at it. "Mama planted those beans," he said, "but the ones that are still growing. She planted them in the spring before she got sick." Mara looked at the bean plants, green and determined, growing whether or not anyone paid attention. "Then they know how to survive," she said. Fergus looked at her for a long moment. He was 10 years old and he had a seriousness to him that she suspected had been there before his mother died, and was something else entirely now. "You think we'll be okay?" he asked. She wasn't a woman who lied to children to spare their feelings, but she also wasn't a woman who crushed small, serious hopes with blunt honesty when the truth was that she didn't actually know. "I think you've got good land," she said, "and you've got each other. What you do with that is up to you." Fergus thought about this. Then he nodded, once, like he was accepting terms he found acceptable. Plus, dinner that second night was the roast, which had come out well, better than the situation probably deserved, with the dried apple pie and the last of the good bread she'd found hidden at the back of the pantry shelf. Silas noticed the bread. "I forgot that was in there," he said quietly, when the boys were noisy with each other down the table. "It kept well," Mara said. "Clara put it there. He stopped, cleared his throat. "She had a habit of keeping a loaf back for special occasions." Mara looked at him. "Then this counts," she said. He didn't answer, but he took a slice. After dinner, she washed the dishes and dried them and put them where they went, and when she turned around, she found all 7 boys sitting at the kitchen table. Not doing anything in particular, just sitting there. "What?" she said. Pem, who was sitting at the near end of the table, put his chin in his hand. "Nothing," he said, in the absolute transparent way of a child who means something. "Go to bed," she told them. "Broker comes early tomorrow, and your father needs the house tidy." They went, slowly, with a great deal of shuffling and exchanging of looks, and she finished cleaning the kitchen in the quiet that was left. She went to bed. She told herself, tomorrow, dinner for the broker. $3. Then the road south. "This is not your life, Mara Quinn. You know better than this." She had been telling herself variations of this for years. She was usually right. She lay in the dark and listened to the windmill and thought about Pem's one boot and Clara Boone's bread and the bean plants that kept growing, whether anyone paid attention or not. Not your life, she told herself firmly. She almost believed it. In the morning, when she went to put on her coat and get her bag from the corner where she'd left it, she stopped. The bag was gone. Not missing, not moved, gone. She checked behind the door, under the bed, in the hallway. Nothing. She stood in the middle of the small room and looked at the empty corner and thought, of course. When she went to the kitchen, all 7 boys were standing in a row against the far wall. They had the collective expression of people who have committed to a plan and are now experiencing some uncertainty about it, but are too far in to turn back. Pem was holding her cast iron skillet. "Morning," said Callum, with a caution that was almost comically elaborate. Mara crossed her arms. "Where's my bag, Callum?" Callum looked at his brothers. His brothers looked at the floor, the ceiling, anywhere but at her. "We thought," Callum started, stopped, tried again. "We thought maybe you might want to stay for the dinner today, and after that, for a while." "I agreed to stay through today's dinner. I told your father—" "We know what you told him." Callum's voice was steady, but there was something under it, not manipulation, nothing calculated, just the plain desperation of a boy who had been holding things together with his bare hands for months and was running out of grip. "But you fixed the garden, and you fed us, and you—" He stopped, and when he continued, his voice was quieter. "You looked for Pem's boot." Mara looked at the row of boys, at Callum's careful face, at Hale, who was pretending to look at the ceiling, at the 4 younger ones who were watching her with a collective attention that was almost unbearable in its honesty, at Pem, who was still clutching the skillet, who met her eyes with no strategy at all, just a 5-year-old wanting something he couldn't quite name. "Where's my bag?" she said. "And who has it?" More looking at the floor. "Dodd," Callum said, not quite a question. Dodd, age 11, reached behind him and produced her bag from wherever it had been stashed behind the doorframe. He held it out to her with the expression of someone who has done the wrong thing for entirely sincere reasons. She took it. She stood there holding it for a moment. The broker was coming this morning. The dinner was tonight. $3 and the road south. "Not your life, Mara Quinn." She set the bag back down in the corner. "Someone start the fire," she said. "I need the oven hot by 7. No one moved for a full 3 seconds. Then the kitchen erupted. The fire was going by 6:30, and by 7 the kitchen smelled like wood smoke and rendered fat and something close to normal, which Mara was beginning to understand was not a small thing in this house. She didn't announce that she was staying. There was no conversation about terms or duration or what exactly had changed between her picking up the bag and putting it back down. She simply went to work, And the boys, reading the situation with the instinctive accuracy of children who had learned to track adult moods the way ranchers tracked weather, scattered to their chores without being told twice. Callum caught her eye once across the kitchen, brief and careful. She gave him nothing back. Not coldness, just the plain face of a woman who had made a decision and wasn't interested in making it into more than it was. The broker, Eli Garrett, arrived at 10:30 in a hired buggy with a second man riding alongside who turned out to be his assistant, a thin young fellow with ink-stained fingers who wrote things down in a small leather book and said almost nothing the entire visit. Garrett himself was not what Mara had expected. She'd built a picture in her mind from the fragments Callum had given her, some version of a hard-eyed money man who chewed up struggling ranchers for sport. The real Eli Garrett was round-faced and pleasant-seeming, with a broad hat and a ready smile that reached his eyes just often enough to be convincing. He shook Silas's hand on the porch with the warmth of an old acquaintance and asked after the boys by name, which told her he either had a good memory or had done his research, and either way it was worth noting. She watched from the kitchen window while Silas walked him out to look at the herd, the assistant trailing behind with his book. The boys had been told to stay useful and visible, which meant Callum was doing legitimate fence work near the south pasture in plain sight, and the four middle boys were doing a passable impression of purposeful activity around the yard. Pem was sitting on the porch steps with the dog, which was the most honest thing anyone was doing. The roast had been in since early morning. She'd made a proper pan gravy, roasted the last of the root vegetables from the cold box, baked 2 pies, apple and a custard from the eggs, and put together a bread that was actually good, not just acceptable. She was not a woman who did things halfway when she'd committed to doing them. When the men came back from the pasture, she could read the shape of it in Silas's shoulders before she heard a word. He was carrying himself carefully, the walk of a man trying not to show that the conversation hadn't gone the way he needed. Garrett came in for dinner with the easy comfort of a man accustomed to being well received, complimented the smell of the kitchen, and settled at the table like he owned it without quite owning it. He was charming all through the meal, told a story about a cattle drive out of the Meridian Valley that had the younger boys laughing, asked Callum serious questions about the fence line repairs that Callum answered seriously, which Mara could see Garrett filing away. The food was, by any honest measure, excellent. Garrett said so twice, and the second time he said it, he looked at Mara directly, which was the first time he'd acknowledged her as a person rather than a feature of the kitchen. "Mrs. Boone?" he said, question in it. "Miss Quinn," Silas said. "She's been helping us this week." Something moved across Garrett's face, quick and professional and almost invisible. "Well," he said, "Miss Quinn, this is a very fine table." "Thank you," she said, and went back to the kitchen. After the meal, Silas and Garrett went to the front room to talk. Mara washed dishes and listened to the sound of low male voices without being able to make out words, which was deliberate. She recognized the specific acoustic quality of a room where men were having a conversation they didn't want carried to the kitchen. Callum came in and started drying without being asked, his habit now, she'd noticed, and they worked in silence for a while. "How do you think it went?" he asked finally. "I don't know," she said, which was true. He looked at the herd for a long time. He knows about the 5 that Hendricks has." Callum's voice was flat, factual, the voice of someone delivering bad news that has already been processed. He'd have gotten that from the county records before he came. Men like Garrett always know the shape of a thing before they sit down to discuss it. The conversation in there is about price. Mara looked at him sideways. "You're 15 years old." "I know." He set a dried plate on the stack with more care than it needed. "Papa would rather I didn't understand this stuff. But if I don't, then nobody does." She didn't have an answer for that. She turned back to the dishes. The front room went quiet. Then she heard boots on the floorboards and the sound of the door, and she looked out the window and watched Garrett walk back to his buggy with his assistant behind him. He climbed up, settled his hat, and drove back down the wagon trail without looking back. A few minutes later, Silas came into the kitchen. He stood at the counter, and she watched his face do the thing faces did when people were deciding how to dress up bad news or whether to bother. "He offered $32 a head," Silas said. Callum went very still. "The fair market is $45, Silas continued, like he was reading from a document he hadn't written. On 28 head, that's... He stopped. It's not enough, Callum said. No. The word came out of Silas with the weight of something he'd known was coming and had been bracing against for weeks. It's not enough. Not for 3 months of back payments and the spring supply costs both. The kitchen was quiet except for the fire. Did you tell him that? Mara asked. Silas looked at her. I told him I needed time to consider. How long did he give you? 2 weeks. He pressed one hand flat on the counter, a steadying gesture. He said the offer stands for 2 weeks, and then he moves on to the Callaway operation north of here. 2 weeks. Mara looked at the kitchen. The fire she'd built, the pots she'd cleaned, the window over the sink with the view out to the garden where Clara Boone's bean plants were coming up green and stubborn in the afternoon light. Not her problem, she told herself. She believed it somewhat less than she had that morning. What she did not do that afternoon was announce any kind of plan or commitment beyond the immediate. She did not tell Silas she was staying past today. She told herself she was staying one more day to settle what she'd started, and that was all. In practice, what this meant was that she stayed. The household had a rhythm now, barely, unevenly, like a clock that kept almost stopping, and she was part of it whether she'd meant to be or not. The boys had stopped treating her with the watchful caution of the first day. Pem followed her from room to room with no particular agenda. Hale started asking her questions about cooking with the tentative enthusiasm of a child who has discovered an interest and isn't sure yet if it's allowed. Fergus, the serious 10-year-old, brought her things, a smooth stone he found by the creek, a hawk feather, objects offered without explanation in the wordless language of a child, trying to say something he doesn't have words for. Dot and Jeb bickered constantly, loudly, and often within 3 feet of wherever she was working, apparently under the impression that she was some kind of stable fixture around which weather could happen. Callum was different. Callum was always careful, always watching, always doing the math on whatever situation the family was in. She recognized in him the particular shape of a child who had grown up too fast and wasn't entirely sure how to feel about it, proud of his own capability and furious at the circumstances that had made it necessary. Theo, age 7 and the quietest of the brothers she barely saw. He came to meals and did his chores and otherwise seemed to exist in his own interior country, which she suspected had been the case even before his mother died. Silas was harder to read, or maybe just harder to have patience with, because the problem with Silas was that he was not a bad man, or a stupid man, or even a particularly difficult man. He was simply a man who had been handed more than he could carry and had responded by narrowing his focus to the immediate and survivable and letting everything that required a longer view go gray and blurry at the edges. He worked hard every day. He was not unkind to his boys, but the ranch was collapsing around the hard work, the way structures collapsed when the foundational problems went unaddressed long enough. She found him in the barn one evening, 3 days after the broker's visit, doing something to a piece of equipment that she suspected didn't actually need doing, the particular quality of movement that belonged to a man who needed to be physically occupied so he didn't have to sit with his thoughts. You know the fencing on the east section is coming down, she said. He didn't look up. I'm aware. Callum said the cattle have been grazing the west field close to capacity. If the east section goes, you'll have a problem. I'm aware of that too. He set down the tool he'd been using and finally looked at her. There was something in his face that she'd started recognizing, a low-grade resistance, not to her specifically, but to the situation, to being seen clearly by someone outside the family. Miss Quinn, I appreciate what you've been doing here, I do, but I don't need... He stopped, rephrased. I've got a handle on the property issues. Do you? His jaw tightened. Yes. She looked at him for a moment. The east fence, the back payments on the note, the herd count, and the water situation on the north pasture, she said. That's 4 separate problems, each of which can be managed. All 4 of them at once, without cash or additional labor, is a different matter. Silas stared at her. How do you know about the water situation? Callum. A sound from him, not quite frustration, something more like a man discovering a leak he thought he'd patched. Callum talks too much. Callum talks the right amount, she said evenly. You just hear it as too much because you'd rather not have someone who lives in this house understand the full picture. The silence that followed was the kind that could go several directions. Silas picked up the tool again. Set it back down. My father built this ranch, he said finally. He built it out of nothing over 30 years. When he died, he left it to me, and I swore to him. He stopped. It's not just land, it's another stop. The word he was looking for seemed to be lodged somewhere he couldn't reach it. I know, she said. He looked at her. I know what it is, she said. I'm not suggesting you don't fight for it. I'm suggesting you need a clearer picture of the battle. He was quiet for a long moment. The barn was dim and smelled of hay and animals and old wood, and the evening light came in sideways through the gaps in the slats and striped the floor in gold. Outside, she could hear the boys, some kind of game, someone running, Dodd yelling something at Jeb with elaborate indignation. Clara used to say that about me, Silas said, quietly, that I'd rather work harder than think differently. He almost smiled, which she had not yet seen him do, not really. She wasn't wrong. Mara said nothing. I don't know what to do, he said, and it came out plainly, without performance. Just a man telling the truth in the way that men rarely did, because they'd learned it wasn't safe. I know what needs to be done. I don't know how to do all of it with what I have. Then you start with the list, she said. The fence first. Callum and the older boys can manage it if you give them 2 full days on it. Then the cattle count, because if the Hendricks situation can be resolved, you have better options with any buyer. And the note. She paused. Who holds the note? Millhaven Bank. Man named Fosker. His face did something complicated. He's been reasonable so far. The letters have been firm, but reasonable. Then you go to Fosker yourself before the 2 weeks is up. Not Garrett. Garrett is a broker who smelled blood on your operation the moment he drove in. You go to Fosker and you show him a plan. Silas looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. I don't have a plan. Then we make one, she said. She hadn't meant to say we. The word was out before she caught it, and she didn't take it back, because taking it back would have made it into more of a thing than she wanted it to be. She simply left it there and straightened up and said, think about what you know about Fosker, how long you've held the note, what you've paid on time, what the history looks like. I'll talk to Callum about the fence. She walked out of the barn and across the yard in the low evening light, and she did not think about the bag she'd put back in the corner, or how many days ago that had been, or how different the road south looked from the inside of this particular problem. The fence took 3 days, not 2. Callum and Hale did the heavy work. Dodd and Fergus handed materials and dug post holes with more enthusiasm than precision. Mara didn't supervise. She had the kitchen and the household and enough to manage. But she brought water and food out to them at midday, and on the second day she noticed that Silas had joined them, working the line alongside his sons, in a way that was quiet and practical, and seemed to cost him something she couldn't name. On the evening of the 3rd day, she found Theo sitting on the back porch steps alone, watching the light fade over the east pasture, and she sat down next to him because the step was wide enough and there was nothing urgent that needed doing in the next 10 minutes. They sat in silence for a while. Callum says you're not leaving, Theo said, eventually. He was 7 and chose his words with unusual economy. I haven't decided anything permanent, Mara said. Theo accepted this. Mama used to sit here, he said, in the evenings, after the kitchen was done. Did she? She'd just sit. Sometimes she'd bring her mending. Sometimes she'd just sit. He paused. I used to sit with her. We didn't usually talk much. Mara looked at the pasture. The evening star was coming up over the ridge, first light in a sky still blue. Is it okay? Theo asked. That I'm sitting here. She looked at him. He was watching her with careful eyes. Yes, she said. It's okay. He leaned slightly, barely perceptibly, so his shoulder was about 2 inches from her arm. Not touching, just closer. She stayed where she was. On the 5th day of her extended, unannounced, undefined stay at the Boone Ranch, the North Pasture water situation became an immediate problem rather than a pending one. The creek that fed the trough had been running low for weeks, which she'd known in a peripheral way from Callum's inventory of problems. What she hadn't known was that it had been gradually silting up from erosion upstream, and that on this particular Tuesday morning it effectively stopped. Silas came in from the pasture with mud on his boots and a look on his face that was past tired and into something grimmer. How bad? She asked. The herd needs water by tomorrow morning, or we start losing animals. She put down what she was doing. What are the options? He rubbed the back of his neck. There's a spring on the Hendricks side of the property line that doesn't belong to the dispute. It's on land that I don't have access to without Hendricks's agreement, and Hendricks and I... He paused. We've not spoken since the cattle situation. What happened there with the cattle? His face did something complicated. Hendricks claimed the fence going down was deliberate, that I let my cattle onto his land intentionally to damage his crop. That's not what happened. The fence failed. Old post, dry rot. I should have caught it, and I didn't. But he took it to the county rather than coming to me, and the county took the cattle as a hold against damages. And since then, he made a short, helpless gesture. He's not a bad man, Hendricks. We've been neighbors 17 years. But he's been convinced of something that isn't true, and he won't hear different. Mara thought for a moment. Who does hear different? Who around here knows you well enough to speak to your character? Most of the county. Then you're not going to Hendricks with your hat in your hand and an explanation. You're going with someone he respects who can tell him what they know. She paused. Is there anyone who bridges you both? Someone you both trust? Silas was quiet. Doc Renner, he tends both our families. He's about as close to neutral as you get out here. Then you go today. You ask Renner if he's willing to come with you to Hendricks. You don't ask for much. Just access to the spring while your creek is silted and a conversation about the cattle situation that doesn't happen through county papers. And if Hendricks says no, then we figure out what's next. But you try first. He looked at her for a long moment with that same expression she'd seen in the barn, the specific look of a man encountering a kind of direct practical thinking that he recognized as useful and wasn't used to receiving. You've handled situations like this before, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I've cooked for a lot of different operations, she said. You learn things. He went to find Doc Renner. Okay. He came back in the late afternoon with Renner and, following at a careful distance, Del Hendricks himself, a wide, weathered man with a gray beard and the stubborn bearing of someone who had been angry for months and wasn't entirely sure he was ready to stop. They stood in the yard and Mara watched from the kitchen window while something that was not quite an argument and not quite a peace happened in the dust outside. Voices low, serious. Renner doing much of the talking with the calm of a man accustomed to standing between people and their worst instincts. At some point, Silas said something that made Hendricks go still. She couldn't hear it. Then Hendricks looked at the ground for a long moment and nodded. Once. The grudging nod of a man conceding a point he'd hoped to keep. They shook hands. Hendricks drove back out. Renner stayed for coffee, and she heard them talking in the front room, low, more relaxed. The sound of men who had known each other a long time remembering why. When Renner left, Silas came into the kitchen. He sat down at the table, which he rarely did in the middle of the day. He looked at his hands. He's going to let us use the spring, he said. And he's going to drop the claim with the county on the cattle. He said, a pause. He said he'd wondered if he'd gotten the situation wrong, but pride kept him from saying it. Another pause, heavier. He said Clara would have come to him inside the first week and sorted it out, that she wouldn't have let it sit. Mara was quiet for a moment. She sounds like she was a practical woman. She was the most practical person I've ever known. He looked up, and there was something raw in his face now. Not performed grief, but the real kind, the kind that ambushes you in ordinary moments. I keep finding things she managed that I didn't know she was managing, things that just run now. I keep finding the evidence of her everywhere I turn. Mara sat down across from him. She didn't know what to do with that kind of honesty any more than he did, and she didn't pretend to. She just sat there with it. The land note, she said after a while. You need to go to Millhaven before the 2 weeks are up. He straightened. Back to the practical. She recognized that move because she made it herself. I know. I'll go day after tomorrow. Take the fence repair as evidence of active maintenance. Take the resolution with Hendricks, because that puts the 5 cattle back in your count and changes the numbers significantly. She paused. And take whatever history you have of payments made on time. The story you tell Fosker is a ranch with problems that are being addressed, not a ranch in freefall. Silas looked at her across the kitchen table. The afternoon light was coming through the window, and the fire had settled to steady embers. and somewhere outside, two of the boys were arguing about something with the cheerful energy of an argument that wasn't about anything serious. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. "You came here to cook one dinner." Mara considered several answers, settled on the truest one, which was also the simplest. "The bag's still in the corner," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he nodded. One of those nods that accepted an answer without requiring it to be more than it was. She got up and went back to starting dinner. That night, after the boys were in bed and the kitchen was quiet, Mara sat at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone mostly cold and did something she rarely did, which was think about herself rather than the immediate problem. She thought about the 12 miles of wagon trail between this ranch and the crossroads at Copper Hill. She thought about $2.60 that was now $3, plus what Silas had pressed into her hand that morning without discussion. Another $2 for the days beyond the original agreement. $5 and change, which was more than she'd started with, and more than enough to get where she was going. She thought about where she was going and found that she had no picture of it, which was unusual. She had always had a next place, a next job, the next stretch of road. It was how she had organized the last decade of her life, and it had worked well enough in its way. She looked around the kitchen. The cast iron pot she'd reorganized, the larder she'd inventoried and restocked with what she could afford from her own pocket, a fact she had not mentioned and did not intend to. The window over the sink that looked out over the garden. The Boone Ranch was in genuine trouble. The land note, the reduced herd, the water situation, the deferred maintenance that was catching up. None of it was catastrophic individually, but the combination of all of it without cash or planning was going to grind this operation down to nothing inside a year. She had seen it happen to operations twice this size. She knew the shape of the process. She also knew that it was not her problem, not formally, not by any agreement she'd made with anyone. She drank the cold coffee. Pem appeared in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt, one bare foot, one booted foot, because of course the boot was back, looking at her with the uncomplicated directness of a child who has woken up and decided that company is preferable to sleeping. "Go back to bed, Pem," she said. "I couldn't sleep," he said, which was demonstrably true, and therefore not much of an argument. "Come here, then." She pushed back the chair next to her. He climbed up and sat beside her with his small, warm weight, and looked at the table with the serious expression of someone prepared to be up for a while. "Are you thinking?" he asked. "Yes." "About staying?" She looked at him. He looked back at her with the pure, uncalculated attention of a 5-year-old who wanted an honest answer because he didn't yet understand why people gave other kinds. "Yes," she said, "about staying." He nodded, satisfied with this, and leaned his head against her arm. Outside, the windmill turned in the night wind, quieter now. Someone had fixed the worst of the squeal. She thought it had been Callum. And the dark plains of Blackstone Reach stretched out in every direction, enormous and indifferent and oddly patient. She sat there until the boy fell asleep against her arm, and then she sat there a while longer in the dark kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and the last of the apple pie, thinking about what it meant to put a bag back down in a corner, and whether a woman who had spent 10 years learning not to stay anywhere could learn, at 34, to mean it. Silas came back from Millhaven on the third day, which was one day longer than Mara had expected, and when he rode into the yard in the late afternoon, she knew from the way he dismounted, slowly, not the careful slow of a tired man, but the deliberate slow of a man organizing his thoughts before he had to use them, that whatever had happened in Millhaven was not straightforward. She waited. He came into the kitchen and poured himself water from the pitcher and stood at the counter drinking it with the focused attention of a man who needed something to do with his hands. The boys were outside. She was working on the evening meal, beans again, because the larder was honest about their limitations, but beans done right with the salt pork and the onions she'd found going soft in the cold box. "Fosker wasn't there," Silas said. She kept her hands moving. "Who was?" "A man named Aldous Cray. He said he's Fosker's associate, handling the regional accounts while Fosker is in the capital on bank business." He set the cup down. He was a pause that had something careful in it. "He knew the account well, better than I expected a stand-in to know it. He had the full history, payments, the note terms, the default timeline. And he said the bank's position has changed." Silas turned to face her, And she could see it now, not defeat exactly, but the look of a man who had gone to a fight and found the rules different from what he'd been told. Fosker's letter said we had time to bring the payments current. Cray said the bank is calling in the note. Full balance. Within 60 days. Mara stopped stirring. That's not what the letter said, she said. No, it's not. His voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of a man gripping something. I told him that. I told him Fosker's own letter from last month gave us until the spring assessment. Cray said the terms were Fosker's discretion, and Fosker had reconsidered based on the overall condition of the account. A pause. He had numbers, Mara. Herd reduction, the Hendricks dispute, which he already knew about, the deferred maintenance assessments. Someone had given him a full picture of this operation before I walked in. She looked at him. Garrett. Silas nodded, slowly. That's what I think. She turned back to the fire, not because anything needed doing, but because she needed a moment to think without her face giving it away. Eli Garrett, the broker with the ready smile, and the assistant who wrote everything down, who had arrived knowing about the disputed cattle before Silas had mentioned them, who had offered $32 a head on a $45 market, and then given 2 weeks before moving on to the next operation. 2 weeks that aligned, she now suspected, with the time needed for information to travel from a broker to a bank associate and a formal notice to be prepared. Cray made you an offer, she said. It wasn't a question. Silas was quiet for a beat. He said the bank would consider the note settled in full if the ranch were transferred to a land trust they manage. He said it was a common arrangement for operations in default. The family could continue working the land as tenants for... His jaw tightened. A period to be negotiated. Tenants, she said. Yes. She turned around. He was watching her with the expression of a man who had spent 2 days in Millhaven understanding the dimensions of a trap and was only now seeing it completely. That's how they do it, she said. The broker comes in, undervalues the herd, makes an offer you can't accept. It goes back to whoever holds the note. The note gets called early. You can't pay the full balance in 60 days, so you take the settlement. You sign over the land and you become the labor. I know, Silas said. I understand what it is. Do you know Fosker, personally? I've met him twice. He's always seemed... He stopped, reconsidered. He seemed fair. But fair men work inside systems that aren't always fair themselves. Is there anyone in Millhaven you trust who might know whether Fosker is actually in the capital or whether Cray was using that as cover? He thought for a moment. Harlow Renner, Doc Renner's brother, runs the feed supply on Mill Street. He knows everyone who moves through that town. Write him. She turned back to the fire. Tonight. And don't tell Cray you're doing it. Silas watched her for a moment. What else? It wasn't really a question. It was the sound of a man who knew there was a plan forming and was asking to hear it, which was different from when he'd resisted her clarity in the barn 3 weeks ago. Something had shifted in him, not dramatically, not with any announcement, but in the incremental way that trust built itself when people proved reliable under pressure. She adjusted the heat under the beans and thought carefully. 60 days. 28 cattle. No, 33 now that Hendricks had released the 5. The land note, whatever the actual figure was. Garrett's standing offer at $32. The ranch itself, which was in better repair now than it had been a month ago. Fence on the east section solid, water access to the north pasture through the Hendricks agreement, the kitchen garden actually producing again. The offer Garrett made, she said. 32 ahead on 28 cattle. He's since moved on to the Callaway operation, you said. That's what he told me. Has he actually moved on, or is he waiting to see how the Millhaven situation shakes out? She looked at Silas. Because if the land goes to the bank trust, whoever manages that trust will need to sell the herd anyway. Garrett may be positioned to buy them at an even lower price through the trust than he could through you. Silas stared at her. Something moved across his face that was close to anger, not at her, at the shape of it. So whatever I do, only if you do nothing, she said. If the cattle sell at 32, you don't have enough to cover the note. But if you don't sell to Garrett at all and instead move the cattle before the 60 days to a different buyer at fair market, she paused. Do you know any other brokers? Not connected to Garrett's network? There's a stockyard in Fennec, south of here about 40 miles. I've sold there before years ago. What's the contact? Man named Pruitt, Walt Pruitt. He's honest. Old school, doesn't play the kind of games Garrett plays. But he moves smaller volume. He might not take 33 head on short notice. He might if the price is right, Mara said. And the price is right if you come to him before the 60 days are up. You have cattle to sell and you have a timeline. That's a negotiating position, not a desperate one, as long as you don't let it become desperate. If we sell at fair market, you still need to cover 3 months of back payments and have enough left for spring operating costs, she said. I know, it's tight. She picked up the spoon again. But tight is not the same as impossible. Tight is something you can work inside if you're moving deliberately. Silas was quiet for a while. Outside, the sound of the boys drifted in. A laugh, something crashing. Callum's voice with the particular exhausted authority of an oldest child who has intervened in one conflict too many for the day. Mara, Silas said. She looked at him. I want you to understand something. He seemed to be choosing words with unusual care, a man who was not naturally articulate about interior things making an effort. When I sent that telegram, I needed a cook for one dinner. I wasn't looking for... I didn't expect... He stopped. Started again. I've been running this operation the way my father ran it, which was the way his father ran it. One man's decisions, one man's plan. Clara handled the house, and I handled the land, and we each stayed in our... He made a frustrated gesture at the inadequacy of the language. That worked? When she was here? Because she was managing more than I understood. And now... He looked at the kitchen, which was organized and warm and smelled of food, and had all the marks of someone who had imposed order on chaos and maintained it daily. I don't have a plan that gets us through this alone. I know that now. I know you know that, she said. That's not the same as having a plan. No. He met her eyes. Will you help me make one? She held his gaze for a moment. We'll need to talk to Callum. Something moved in Silas's expression, not quite resistance, more like the specific discomfort of a father hearing that his 15-year-old son needed to be at the table for the hard conversation. But he nodded. After dinner, he said. Callum took it the way she'd expected, absorbing the information about Cray and Garrett with the rapid, systematic processing of a person who had been running threat assessments on this operation in the back of their mind for months. He sat at the kitchen table after the younger boys were in bed and listened without interrupting, and when Silas finished, he was quiet for 10 seconds exactly, she counted, before he said, Pruitt and Fenwick, that's the right move. Silas looked at his son. I've been thinking about Pruitt for 3 weeks, Callum said, without apology, but I didn't know about Cray. That changes the timeline. He looked at Mara. You think Fosker is actually in the capital, or you think Cray was using that as cover to keep Papa from going over his head? I think it's worth finding out before we do anything else, she said, which is why your father is writing to Harlow Renner tonight. Callum nodded. And while we wait for that answer, we prepare to move the cattle to Fenwick whether we need to or not, Mara said. Because if the answer comes back that Fosker is genuinely unreachable and Cray has the authority he claims, then 60 days goes fast and we need the cattle sold first. Moving 33 head to Fenwick is 4 days minimum, Callum said. Road conditions. The creek crossing at Ridger's Ford is low right now. Could be 2 extra days if it's worse than... I know, Silas said. Both of them looked at him. He looked like a man who was doing something that cost him something, which was allowing 2 other people to plan at the same table as him without correcting them. I know the road to Fenwick. You're right about the Ford. So we plan for 6 days, Mara said, which means we need to send word to Pruitt this week before Cray has any reason to think you're moving. Callum looked at his father. Papa, the letter to Pruitt, you should send it through Renner, not the Millhaven Post. Silas frowned. Why? Because Millhaven is where Cray works, and men who know your account that well know other things too. He said it simply, without drama. Just a young man who had been paying attention, connecting information that the adults around him had not quite assembled yet. Silas stared at his son for a long moment. Something passed across his face that she couldn't entirely read. Some complicated mixture of pride and pain, and the particular grief of a father seeing his child grown by necessity rather than time. All right, Silas said. Through Renner. Whoa. The letter went out the next morning and the waiting began, which was its own kind of work. Mara had found over the years that the thing about waiting in a crisis was that it had to be managed as actively as any other phase. Left alone, waiting turned to panic, and panic made people do the exact things they shouldn't. She kept the household moving, chores, meals, the ordinary architecture of daily life that anchored people to the present when the future was uncertain. She put Hale in charge of the kitchen garden on a formal basis, which transformed his tentative interest into genuine pride overnight. He came to her with questions she answered without condescension, and by the end of the first week he was producing enough greens from the garden that she'd reduced the larder spend by a meaningful amount, which she noted and he noticed her noting, and it mattered to him. She had Dodd and Fergus start on the south barn roof, which had been losing shingles since winter. They were 11 and 10 and not particularly suited to roof work, but with Silas spotting them from below and clear instructions, they managed it, badly at first, then with improving confidence. The process produced 3 arguments: one near disaster involving a hammer and Dodd's foot, and a finished roof that would hold through another season. Theo she found one afternoon sitting in the kitchen garden between the bean rows, not doing anything, just sitting in the dirt in the sun with his knees pulled up, in the way that some children sat when they needed to be near growing things and didn't know that was what they needed. She didn't send him away. She brought her shelling beans and sat a few feet away and worked, and after a while he started talking, not about anything important, just about a hawk he'd seen over the ridge that morning, and the way the creek sounded different when the water was low, and a question about whether beans knew they were growing. She answered the questions she could and left the others alone. It was Pem who told her on the 6th day of waiting, in the unfiltered way of 5-year-olds, that the boys had been having nighttime meetings. "Where?" she asked. "Callum's room," Pem said. "They talk about the ranch, and money, and you." "What about me?" Pem thought about this with evident care. "About whether you'll leave," he said, "when it's done." She didn't answer that. She handed him a piece of bread with jam, the last of the good jam, she'd been saving it, and changed the subject. But that night, after the house was quiet, she sat with it. The honest version of it. She had not made any agreement beyond day to day. She had not said anything to Silas or Callum or any of the boys that could be interpreted as a permanent arrangement. And yet she had been here 5 weeks, and the bag was in the corner, and she had reorganized the kitchen and fixed the garden and helped develop a plan to save the ranch from a land scheme. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, the line between hired help in a crisis and person who lives here had blurred past the point where she could clearly locate it. She had been careful, her whole adult life, not to become necessary to people. Necessary was a trap. It looked like being valued, but it meant being unable to leave. And she had left enough hard situations to know that the ability to leave was the thing that made staying survivable. Once you were necessary, leaving became abandonment, and then you were trapped by your own usefulness. She sat in the dark kitchen and thought, when did I become necessary here? And the honest answer was, the morning she put the bag back down. Harlow Renner's reply came on the 8th day, delivered by a rider who had come from Doc Renner's place. Silas opened it at the kitchen table with Callum beside him and Mara across from them, and he read it through once and then set it down with a flatness to the motion that told her most of what she needed to know before he spoke. "Fosker has been in Millhaven the whole time," Silas said. Callum's jaw set. "He's been in his office, according to Harlow. No capital trip, no extended absence." Silas looked at the letter again, like he was hoping the words would have rearranged themselves into something different. They hadn't. "Cray came in about 3 weeks ago. He's been introduced as Fosker's associate, which is technically true, but Harlow says the word on Mill Street is that Cray comes out of a land management firm based in Halverton. They have a pattern, Harlow used that word, pattern, of working alongside brokers to identify distressed rural properties. Garrett and Cray, Mara said. Yes. Silas folded the letter with the careful movements of a man keeping himself very controlled. They work together, have been for at least 2 years from what Harlow can gather. Callum looked at his father. His voice was even, deliberate, and about 6 years older than his face. Then we need to go over Cray's head, directly to Fosker. Fosker knows what's happening, Silas said. He has to. Cray is operating out of his building. Maybe. Or maybe Cray has more latitude in that office than Fosker realizes. Callum spread his hands on the table, a gesture she'd seen Silas make, absorbed without knowing it. Either way, you have the right to speak to the man who holds the note. That's not a courtesy, Papa. That's a legal standing. Silas looked at Mara. She had been thinking since the letter arrived, and what she'd been thinking had arrived at a place that felt like a risk, a real one, not a managed one, not the kind she was used to operating inside. She'd been building towards something for 5 weeks, and it had brought her here, to a kitchen table in Blackstone Reach, and the next step was either the plan or it wasn't. There's a way to do this, she said, but it's going to require more than a visit to Fosker's office. Tell me, Silas said. She took a breath. You go to Fosker directly, with documentation. The fence repair, the Hendricks resolution, the water access agreement, all of it written out clearly, showing active management of the problems the account identified. That's the first piece. Yeah, she paused. The second piece is the cattle. You reach Pruitt this week and you get a commitment, not a sale, just a commitment to purchase at fair market pending a 30-day window. That gives you a concrete plan for covering the back payments. And the third piece, Callum said, because he could hear there was one. Mara looked at the table for a moment. You challenge the authority of Cray's notice. A note can't be called early without the signature of the named holder, which is Fosker. If Fosker signed off on it, you need to see that documentation. If he didn't, she met Silas's eyes. Then what Cray handed you in that office isn't a legal notice. It's a piece of theater. The kitchen was very quiet. How do you know that? Silas said. I know it because I cooked for a land lawyer in Delridge for 4 months, and he talked about his cases the way most men talked about the weather. She said it plainly, because plain was the only useful way to say it. I'm not a lawyer, but the principle is straightforward enough that you don't need to be. Silas was looking at her with an expression she'd stopped trying to categorize. It changed too often, or rather, it was always the same expression with different things moving through it. If Fosker did sign off on it, he said, then you're still better off knowing that now than at day 60, she said. And you go to Pruitt, and you sell the cattle, and you fight on the back payment terms with a real number in hand. Callum leaned forward. There's a lawyer in Copper Hill, Wade Estes. He's not expensive, and he's handled property disputes before. Can we afford him? Silas asked. Callum looked at the table. I have money set aside, Mara said. Both of them looked at her. She kept her expression neutral. It's a loan, against whatever the ranch earns when this is resolved. Maras, Silas started. It's a loan, she said again. We can settle the terms later. Right now we need Estes before you walk into Fosker's office. The silence was long enough that she could hear the windmill outside, steady in the afternoon wind. Then Callum reached out and put his hand flat on the table, just for a second, a quick, deliberate gesture, and looked at his father. She's right, Callum said. Papa, she's right. Silas looked at his son. He looked at Mara. He looked at his hands on the table, the hands of a man who had built fences and tended cattle and buried his wife and held 7 boys together with the sheer force of daily effort, and he said quietly, all right. The next 4 days moved with a velocity that had its own specific texture, not the frantic motion of panic, but the dense, purposeful momentum of people doing difficult things in a short window. Silas rode to Copper Hill and found Wade Estes, who was thin and sharp-eyed and charged $12 for a consultation, which Mara produced from the folded cloth at the bottom of her bag without ceremony. Estes reviewed the note documentation that Silas had brought and confirmed within the hour what Mara had suspected. Cray's notice bore a stamp from the Millhaven Bank, but not Fosker's personal signature on the acceleration clause, which under the terms of the original note was required. It's not nothing, Estes said, because lawyers were careful people. Fosker may have authorized it verbally, and the paperwork is coming. But right now, as it stands, what you were handed is not a valid notice of acceleration. What do I do with that? Silas said. You walk into Fosker's office with me behind you, Estes said, and we ask him to produce the signed authorization. And we watch very carefully what his face does when we ask. Silas came home that evening looking like a man who had rediscovered the specific energy that came from having a legitimate foothold in a fight. Not confidence, he was too experienced for false confidence, but the steadier thing, the thing that looked like it might actually hold. Mara sent word through Doc Renner to Walt Pruitt in Fenwick. The reply came in 2 days. Pruitt could take 33 head at $43, $2 below full market, which she had expected, and which was still enough. She did the math at the kitchen table at night, with the lamp turned low and the house sleeping around her. 33 cattle at $43 was just over $1,400. 3 months of back payments on the note were $240. Spring operating costs, conservatively, another $150. Estes' full fee if it went to a formal challenge, $200. That left roughly $800 in reserve. Not comfortable, not what a healthy operation looked like, but enough. Enough to plant in the spring. Enough to make it to the next season and let the land start returning what it owed. She wrote the numbers down and looked at them and thought about the difference between enough and nothing, which was a gap she had navigated her whole adult life and which, she knew from experience, was actually traversable by people willing to be precise about it. She heard footsteps on the stairs, and Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway, in the same way he sometimes did late at night. Not insomnia exactly, more the habit of a working rancher whose body woke him at odd hours for no reason. He looked at the lamp, at her, at the paper on the table. "Numbers," he said. "Sit down." He sat. She turned the paper so he could read it. He studied it for a long time without speaking. She watched his face, the movement behind his eyes as he worked through it, the specific expression of a man checking her work and finding it sound. 800 reserve, he said. Roughly. It's not generous. No. He looked up. But it's real. Yes. He looked at the paper again. His hands were flat on the table, not gripping anything, not braced against anything, just resting. She didn't know when she'd last seen his hands look like that. When Clara died, he said, after a while, I kept thinking I needed to figure out how to do everything she did, plus everything I did, all of it, by myself. He paused. That was the wrong way to think about it. I can see that now, but when you're in it, he made a short, helpless motion. When you're in it, you can't see the wrong thinking. You just feel like you're failing at everything because you're trying to be two people. Mara was quiet. I'm not... He stopped, started again, in the careful way he had when he was attempting to say something true and precise. I'm not confusing you with her. I want to be clear about that. You're not the same. You're not Clara. You're not filling... He stopped again, something frustrated in his face at the inadequacy of language for the thing he was trying to say. What I mean is that I see what you've done here, not as a replacement for something, as its own thing, and He met her eyes. I want you to know that I see it. She held his gaze for a moment. The cattle move in 5 days, she said. You and Callum should go to Millhaven with Estes the day after tomorrow, before Pruitt's window closes. He didn't look away. I know. And when this is over, the note, the cattle, Cray, then we should talk. About what comes after. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, more like a man hearing something confirmed that he had been very carefully not assuming. All right, he said. After. She folded the paper, extinguished the lamp. In the dark kitchen, she listened to Silas go back up the stairs, and she sat for a moment in the particular silence of a house full of sleeping people, a warm silence, different in quality from the silence of empty rooms. And she thought that there was a difference between the life she'd been living and the life that was becoming possible in this place, and that the distance between them was smaller tonight than it had ever been before. Outside, the plains of Blackstone Reach lay dark and enormous under a sky full of stars, and the windmill turned steadily in the night wind, and the bean plants Clara had put in the ground last spring kept growing in the dark the way they always did, patient, stubborn, knowing nothing about the trouble around them, only the direction of the light. They left for Millhaven before sunrise, Silas, Callum, and Wade Estes in the lawyer's wagon, the documentation folded in a leather case that Estes kept on his lap, with the proprietary care of a man who understood that paper was sometimes the only weapon that mattered. Mara stood in the yard and watched them go. Pem stood beside her in his nightshirt, one hand loosely holding a fistful of her skirt, without seeming to know he was doing it. The wagon disappeared down the rut trail into the dark, and she stood there until the sound of the wheels faded, and there was nothing left but the pre-dawn wind off the plains and the windmill turning in it. Will they be okay? Pem asked. Yes, she said. She meant it as the useful kind of certainty, the kind you offered not because you were sure, but because certainty had practical value when uncertainty didn't. She went inside and started the fire. The next 2 days ran on a different kind of tension, not the planning tension of the previous weeks, which had at least given her something to push against. But the waiting tension of a situation that was now entirely out of her hands. She managed it the same way she'd managed it before. She kept moving. She kept the boys moving. She did not allow the household to slow down into the particular torpor that set in when people were anxious and had nothing constructive to do with it. Hale ran the kitchen garden with the seriousness of a person who had discovered a genuine aptitude and was privately amazed by it. The late beans were producing well. The tomatoes had rallied, and he'd found, on his own initiative, that the overgrown patch along the east fence line had wild herbs in it, something woody and fragrant that she identified as a variety of sage, and had pulled it up and dried it and presented it to her with the expression of someone handing over a significant gift, which it was. Dodd and Fergus had, in the absence of direct supervision, developed a complicated ongoing project involving the construction of something in the back corner of the barn that she deliberately did not investigate too closely, operating on the principle that boys building unsupervised structures were less dangerous than boys with no project at all. Theo had taken to following Mara with the quiet consistency of a shadow, not demanding anything, just present, sitting nearby when she was in the kitchen, working in the garden while she was there. She had stopped commenting on it. His company had a particular quality that she found she had come to rely on without noticing, the way you relied on the sound of the windmill until it stopped. Jeb, age 6 and the most consistently unpredictable member of the household, managed on the second day of waiting to fall off the fence rail on the north side of the yard and cut his chin open on the post below it with an efficiency of injury that was almost impressive. Mara cleaned and closed it with 2 small strips of cloth and adhesive she found in the medicine kit Clara had kept on the high shelf, and held his chin steady while he alternated between trying to be brave and losing the battle, and told him in a plain, steady voice that it was going to hurt for another minute and then stop, which it did, and that he'd have a small scar that would look distinguished when he was older, which she was not entirely sure was true, but which she calculated he needed to hear more than he needed accuracy. "What's distinguished mean?" Jeb said. The bleeding slowed to nothing. "It means people will think you've done something interesting," she said. He touched the bandage with careful fingers. "Did you get your scar from something interesting?" She looked at the scar on her forearm, grease fire in a mining camp, a bad night, a bad situation that had preceded a decision to leave. "Somewhat," she said. He nodded, satisfied. Then he climbed off the kitchen chair and went back outside, apparently fully recovered, and she heard him telling Fergus within approximately 45 seconds that the scar was going to make him look distinguished. She found herself almost smiling, which was a thing she'd started doing with increasing frequency and not always in control of. On the evening of the second day, she was in the yard splitting kindling, a task she had taken over from Callum's absence without discussion, the axe finding its familiar rhythm when she heard the wagon. She set the axe down and shaded her eyes against the low evening sun and waited. She read it in Callum's posture before the wagon reached the yard. He was sitting straight, which was different from the careful, controlled tension he'd been carrying for weeks. Silas had his hat pushed back, a small thing, but she knew that hat and the angle it sat at in various conditions, and this angle was not the angle of a man in crisis. They pulled in. Callum jumped down before the wagon stopped and landed in the yard with a physical energy she hadn't seen in him before. Unguarded. Unmanaged. Fusker confirmed he didn't sign the acceleration clause, Callum said, and his voice came out with a crack in it that he didn't try to cover. Cray presented the document to him as routine correspondence, and he stamped it without reading it. When Estes put it in front of him and asked him to locate his actual signature on the acceleration provision, he stopped, swallowed. He couldn't because it wasn't there. Silas climbed down from the wagon more slowly. He looked like a man who had been through something that had taken a great deal out of him and had given something back in return, and was still in the process of calculating the net. Fosker was... He paused, picking the word carefully. He was not pleased. With Cray. Or with the situation. Estes climbed down last and stretched his back with the expression of a man who had ridden 40 miles in a wagon and was going to feel it tomorrow. Cray has been removed from the account, he said, with the professional neutrality of a man reporting facts. Fosker has suspended whatever arrangement he had with him, pending a review. Whether that review produces anything actionable? He shrugged. That's a longer road. But the notice of acceleration is void. The original terms of the note stand. Mara was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. The original terms, she said. 3 months of arrears to be brought current by the spring assessment, Estes confirmed. Same as Fosker's original letter said. She looked at Silas. He looked at her. Pruitt's commitment is still open for 12 more days, she said. I know, he said. Then we move the cattle. He nodded, and then, quietly, without announcement, as if he simply didn't have the energy anymore to maintain the particular armor of a self-sufficient man, he said, Thank you, Mara. She didn't deflect it. She'd learned by now that deflecting genuine gratitude from people who didn't offer it easily was its own kind of discourtesy. Go eat something, she said, both of you. There's stew, H&M. The cattle drive to Fenwick took 6 days. She had not planned to go. It was a practical operation. Silas, Callum, Hale, and the 2 Barlow brothers from the neighboring claim who Silas had arranged to hire for the drive. And her place was at the ranch managing the household. That was the sensible division. What actually happened was that on the morning of departure, she was packing food for the drive, and Silas came into the kitchen and said, without preamble, I'd like you to come, if you're willing. She looked at him. The boys here will be fine for 6 days, he said. Dodd is 11 and more capable than he acts. Fergus can manage the younger ones for a week. Del Hendricks said his wife would check in. He paused. Another pause, the particular pause of a man saying something he had decided to say, rather than something that came naturally. I'd like you there. She thought about it for approximately 3 seconds. I'll pack for 7 days, she said, in case the ford is as bad as Callum said. The Ridgers Ford crossing was exactly as bad as Callum had said. And on the 3rd day of the drive, it cost them half a day and one near disaster when the water came up faster than anticipated on the crossing, and the youngest of the Barlow brothers, 19 and less experienced than he'd represented, lost control of his horse in the current and went sideways into 3 of the cattle before Callum got there on a rope and sorted it out with the focused competence of someone who had been managing crises since he was 12 years old. That evening, camped on the south bank with the ford behind them and the cattle settled, Silas and Callum sat by the fire with the particular quietness of people who had come through something and were now in the specific rest that followed. You handled that well, Silas said to Callum, across the fire looking at him directly. Callum looked up. He had a wariness in his expression that she recognized, the wariness of a child bracing for a qualification, a but, the part where the praise became a correction. It didn't come. The rope work, Silas said. That was good thinking. Callum was quiet for a moment. I watched you do it at the South Creek 3 years ago. When we lost the Hendricks fence the first time and the cattle, I remember, Silas said. Another silence, but a different quality to it. She was sitting slightly apart with her coffee, deliberately not looking at them directly because some things needed the privacy of not being fully witnessed. Papa, Callum said, and then stopped, like he'd arrived at the word he'd been trying to get to and wasn't sure what came after it. I know, Silas said, just that, quiet. Callum looked at the fire. His jaw worked. He was 15 years old, and he had been carrying the weight of an adult for 8 months, and he was, under all of it, still 15. And for a moment, just a moment, that showed through in his face like light through a gap in a wall. Silas reached across the space between them and put his hand briefly on the back of his son's neck, the way you steadied something you were afraid to break, and Callum didn't pull away, and they sat like that for a few seconds. And then Silas took his hand back, and they both looked at the fire, and that was the whole of it. She drank her coffee. Walt Pruitt was a wide, slow-moving man in his 60s with a deeply lined face and hands that looked like they'd been made from old saddle leather. He met them at the Fenwick stockyard on the morning of the 6th day and walked the herd with the unhurried assessment of a man who had been looking at cattle for 40 years and had no interest in pretending the process was faster than it was. Silas walked beside him. She stayed back with Callum near the fence. He's going to try 41, Callum said quietly, watching his father. Your father will hold at 43, she said. You sure? He came 6 days through bad road for 43. He knows the number. She was right. The negotiation was short. She could see it in the body language. 2 men who respected each other's position and had no interest in theater. They shook hands. Pruitt's man came out with the paperwork. Silas signed it and came back to the fence with the expression of a man who has just put down something very heavy. 43, he said. Callum let out a breath. Minus Estes' fee and your loan, Silas said, looking at Mara. Pay Estes first, she said. My loan keeps. No, it keeps, Silas. She said it without heat, just firmness. Get through the spring, then we settle it. He looked at her for a long moment. You're the most stubborn person I know, he said. You're raising 7 boys on an open plains ranch, she said. You need stubborn people around you. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but was close to it, closer than she usually got from him in broad daylight. Yes, he said. Suppose I do. They were 3 days home from Fenwick when the drought that had been threatening all summer finally arrived in earnest. She'd known it was coming. The signs had been there for weeks. The creek running lower every day, the grass on the west field going yellow at the tips. The particular quality of the afternoon air that old ranchers called dry hot, the kind that pulled moisture out of everything it touched. She'd been managing for it quietly, rationing the water use in the kitchen, keeping the garden irrigated from the Hendricks spring access while they had it, making sure the cistern stayed covered. What she hadn't anticipated, because no one had told her, and it turned out Silas hadn't thought to mention it, was the North Pasture well. The North Pasture well was the backup water source for the entire east side of the property. The side that held the barn, the chicken coop, the remaining cattle that hadn't been sold. It was a hand-dug well, old, lined with stone, and it had been slowly failing for 2 years. Silas knew this. Callum knew this. It had been on the list of problems below the more urgent problems, which was the practical reality of a ranch with more needs than resources. On the 4th day after their return from Fenwick, the North Pasture well went dry. She found out when Fergus came running into the kitchen at mid-morning with the specific expression of a child who has discovered something wrong and is not entirely sure of the scale of it. The well bucket's coming up empty, he said. She went with him. She looked down the well shaft at nothing, dry stone, dry dirt, no water. She stood there for a moment doing calculations she did not like the results of. The Hendricks spring access covered the kitchen needs and the garden. The main house cistern had maybe 10 days of supply if they were careful. The creek, running low, could support the cattle if they were moved to the south pasture where the creek crossed. But the south pasture fence had a section that Dodd and Fergus had repaired, and she was not entirely confident in the repair. Get Dodd, she said to Fergus, and find your father. Silas was in the barn. He came out, listened to her report, and looked at the dry well with an expression that she had learned to read accurately over weeks of watching him. This one was not panic, was not defeat, was the controlled frustration of a man confronting a problem he deferred past the point of deferring. The south pasture fence, she said. Dodd's repair will hold for light use, he said, not for 30 head pressing against it toward the creek. So we reinforce it before we move them. That's a full day's work. Then we start now. He looked at her. We. Do you have a better use of my time today? He didn't. They spent the rest of the morning on the south fence. Silas, Mara, Hale, Dodd, and Fergus, working the line from the creek crossing back to the corner post. It was hot, physical work. Mara had done enough ranch labor in her years of moving between operations to know how to handle a post driver and how to read a fence line for weak points. And she did it without comment. And after the first half hour, the boys had stopped giving her the sideways looks of children surprised by an adult's competence, and had simply accepted it as a fact of the situation. By late afternoon, the fence was solid. They moved the cattle. That evening, sitting on the back porch in the heat with water that tasted of the cistern's age, Silas said, I need to find a solution for the well. I know. A driller costs money we don't have right now. I know that too. She looked out at the south pasture where the cattle were settled near the creek. The evening was copper-colored and still and hot in the way that announced more dry days to come. What about the Barlow brothers? You hired them for the drive. Do they drill? Ed Barlow does some, Silas said slowly. He's not a professional, but he knows the technique. And if you paid him in kind, feed from the fall harvest, maybe a day's labor exchange. Silas was quiet, working through it. Maybe. Ed's always been fair about that kind of arrangement. Then tomorrow, before we lose another day. He looked at her sideways. You ever stop? Stop what? Solving things. She considered this. I stop when there's nothing left to solve, she said. This ranch has not reached that condition yet. He made a sound that was, finally, unambiguously, a laugh. Short and rough and surprised out of him, the laugh of a man who had forgotten what it felt like and then encountered it unexpectedly. She looked at him, and his face, in the copper evening light, looked briefly like a face that had more life in it than it had been showing for a long time. No, he said. I suppose it hasn't. Ed Barlow agreed to the drilling exchange, came with his equipment on the third day of the drought, and found water at 32 feet, deeper than the old well, which explained why the old one had failed in a dry year, and deep enough that another dry year wouldn't touch it. It was not a fast process, and it was not a clean one. And on the second day of drilling, Dodd managed to get into the drilling mud in a way that defied logical explanation and had to be hosed down in the yard by Fergus with the expression of someone performing a civic duty. Silas paid the 3 months of arrears to the Millhaven Bank, not through Cray, who had been formally dismissed from the account, but in a direct meeting with Fosker himself, which Estes attended as a precaution. Fosker, Estes reported afterward, had the demeanor of a man who was embarrassed about something and covering it with extra formality. He accepted the payment, confirmed the account in good standing, and sent them out with paperwork that Estes reviewed 3 times before pronouncing it sound. The drought lasted 19 days in its worst form and then broke in a single overnight storm that Mara heard arrive. The change in the wind, the smell of rain on dry earth, the first drops on the porch roof, and lay awake listening to until it settled into steady rainfall that went on until morning. She got up before light and went to the window and watched the rain come down in the dark and felt something ease in her chest that had been held tight for 3 weeks. Behind her she could hear the house, creaks, and the sound of rain on the roof, and somewhere the soft sound of one of the younger boys turning over in sleep. She heard footsteps, and Silas appeared at the top of the stairs in the dark, moving toward the window on the other side of the landing that looked out east. He stood there looking at the rain for a moment without seeing her, and then he did see her, and they looked at each other across the dark hallway. "It's a good rain," he said quietly. "Yes." He leaned against the door frame. He looked tired, and he looked lighter, somehow, than she'd seen him look since she arrived. Like something had been set down. "I'm going to need to hire someone for the fall," he said. "A real hand. Can't keep running this place on boys and borrowed labor." "I know. And the spring planting, if we're smart about what we put in, the West Field could carry a decent crop alongside the cattle operation. Clara always wanted to diversify. He stopped. "I kept telling her the ranch was a cattle operation, that we didn't do crops." A quiet pause. "She was right, and I was wrong, and I knew it even then." "You can do it now," Mara said. He looked at her. "We talked," he said, "you and me, before the drive, about what comes after." "We did. I'd like to have that conversation," he said. "Not tonight, but soon." She looked at him in the dark hallway with the rain coming down outside. She thought about the bag in the corner, about the road south that she could still picture. She'd been on enough roads to hold them clearly, and how the picture had gone soft at the edges recently, like a drawing left in the weather. "Soon," she said. He nodded, went back to his room. She stood at the window a while longer and listened to the rain on the roof of the Boone Ranch and watched the dark plains of Blackstone Reach take the water they'd been waiting for. And she thought that there was a particular kind of hard thing in the world, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that came with a single clear moment of decision, but the slow kind, the kind that happened the way a creek changed course, not all at once, but grain by grain, until one day you looked up and the water was going somewhere different than it used to go, and you couldn't remember exactly when the change had happened, only that it had. She had come to this place with $2.60 and one night's agreement. She did not know, standing at that window in the dark, exactly what she had now, only that it was more than she'd started with, and that the more was not money. The rain kept coming. The new well, 32 feet down, held steady. Out in the south pasture, the cattle stood in the rain with the untroubled patience of animals who knew the difference between weather that passed and weather that didn't, and waited for the morning. The morning after the rain, the Boone Ranch smelled like wet earth and possibility. which was not a small thing after 19 days of dust and rationing and the specific anxiety of watching the sky and finding nothing in it. Mara was up before anyone else, as she always was. She stood on the back porch with her coffee and watched the sun come up over the east ridge, slow and red-orange, the kind of sunrise that only happened after a storm had cleared the air of everything that had been sitting in it. The south pasture was green-dark and wet. The creek was running properly for the first time in weeks. She could hear it from here. The garden, which Hale had kept irrigated through the drought with a devotion that had cost him more daily labor than she'd asked for, was standing upright and alive in a way that felt like a small argument against everything the last 19 days had tried to say. She drank her coffee and thought about what Silas had said in the dark hallway. Soon. The problem with soon was that it required a person to know what they wanted before the conversation arrived. Mara Quinn had spent the better part of her adult life being very clear about what she didn't want. Didn't want to be trapped, didn't want to be necessary, didn't want to build something she couldn't walk away from. She had organized 10 years around those refusals, with the discipline of someone who had learned their lessons in conditions that left marks. What she wanted was a murkier question. She had stopped asking it somewhere around the 5th or 6th year on the road, because asking it produced answers she couldn't do anything with. She was asking it again now, standing on this porch in this wet morning and finding that the answers had changed without her permission. She heard the back door open and Theo appeared beside her, still in his nightshirt, his dark hair pressed flat on one side from sleep. He stood next to her and looked at the pasture with the serious assessment of a 7-year-old evaluating weather the way his father evaluated weather, as information, as a condition to be understood. "The creek's back," he said. "It is." "Hale's going to want to expand the garden," he said. "He told me. He wants to put in a second bed along the east fence." "He's right that the soil over there is good," she said. Theo looked up at her. He had gotten incrementally braver over the weeks, not louder, not more demanding, just more willing to occupy space near her. "Are you staying?" he asked. The same question Pem had asked weeks ago, but from Theo it had a different weight, less the need of a 5-year-old and more the careful inquiry of a child who had learned that good things in his life were not guaranteed to be permanent. She looked at him. She thought about the conversation she needed to have with Silas, which hadn't happened yet, which she had been circling like a person circling something they were not entirely sure was safe. "I'm here today," she said. "Let's start with that." He seemed to find this acceptable. He went back inside, and she heard him in the kitchen starting the fire, something he'd begun doing in the mornings without being asked sometime in the last week. She hadn't commented on it. Some things were better received without ceremony. The conversation with Silas happened 3 days later, which was not because either of them was avoiding it, but because the ranch in the aftermath of drought and the financial crisis had a backlog of immediate needs that didn't arrange themselves politely around personal conversations. There was the well to finish sealing, the south fence to properly inspect after the heavy rain, the account ledger to go through now that the arrears were paid and Pruitt's payment had cleared, and a letter from Estes saying that the county was reviewing Cray's activities in the region and that Silas might be asked to provide a statement, which he drafted with Callum's help on a quiet evening while Mara kept the younger boys occupied in the kitchen. It happened in the evening, as things often happened in that house. After supper, after the younger boys were in bed, in the specific quiet that settled over the place when the daily work was done. Callum had gone up early, which Mara suspected was not accidental. Silas came into the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee and put one in front of her without asking, which was itself a statement of something. He sat across from her. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to be straightforward about it because I don't know another way to be." "All right." He looked at his coffee, looked up. "I'd like you to stay. Not as hired help. That's not—" He stopped, worked through it. "I'd like you to stay as a permanent part of this household, in whatever form that takes, however you want to define it, at whatever pace makes sense to you." He paused. "I know that's not a small thing to ask. I know you've been living a certain kind of life for a long time, and this is different from that." She looked at him across the kitchen table. He looked back at her with the direct, uncomfortable honesty of a man who had done the calculus and decided that plain speech was less risky than the alternative. "What I'm not asking," he said carefully, "is for you to replace something that's gone. I want to be clear about that. Clara is, she was—" He stopped. "Let it be what it was." I'm not asking you to be her. I'm asking you to be here, as yourself, which is a short pause, which is more than enough, more than I expected when I sent that telegram. Mara was quiet for a moment. I'm not easy to live with, she said. I run things the way I think they should be run, and I don't naturally ask permission. I noticed. I have strong opinions about kitchens and gardens and how boys should be raised, and some of them are going to conflict with yours. I know. And she paused. I'm not practiced at this, at staying. I haven't done it in a long time, and there's a difference between knowing you want to do something and knowing how. I'm not practiced at asking, Silas said, or at letting someone else be in the room with me when things are hard. Clara did most of the work of making that possible, and He stopped. I took that for granted in ways I understand now that I didn't then. He met her eyes. I'm not going to promise I won't do it again. I probably will. I'm just telling you I know it. She held his gaze. This was the part she had not let herself think past. This specific moment, this specific question with its specific weight. The loan, she said. We settle it. He looked slightly surprised by the direction. Mara, not as a gift, not forgiven. We settle it on terms we both agree to. That matters to me. She paused. Because if I'm staying, I need it to be as a person with standing here, not as someone owed a debt of gratitude. There's a difference, and it's not a small one. He looked at her for a long moment. You're talking about being a partner in this operation. I'm talking about being a person who belongs here on her own terms, she said. What that looks like practically, we can work out. But yes, that's the general shape of it. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him processing it, not reluctantly, but with the seriousness of a man who understood that she was describing something real and not a formality. All right, he said. All right, she said. They drank their coffee. Outside, the night plains of Blackstone Reach were dark and enormous, and the creek was running steadily, and the windmill was turning in the late wind. It was not a romantic moment in any way she would have described from the outside. It was two people at a kitchen table in the plain light of a lamp that needed its wick trimmed, drinking coffee that had gone a little cold, agreeing to a life. It was, she thought, the most honest conversation she'd had in years. Joy. What followed was not a transformation. She wanted to be clear about that in her own mind, because she distrusted transformations. They made good stories and poor foundations. What followed was work. The same work she'd been doing, continuing, because that was what the ranch needed, and it didn't care about the status of the conversation at the kitchen table. But some things were different in their texture. She moved her bag from the corner room off the kitchen to the room at the end of the upstairs hall, which was larger and had a window that looked east over the pasture. She did this without ceremony, in the middle of a Tuesday morning while Silas was checking the new well and the boys were at their respective tasks. She made 2 trips. The bag, the coat, the small case that held the things she'd accumulated in a decade of moving, a folding knife, a worn map of the territory she no longer consulted, a handful of letters from people she'd worked for who had wanted her to know they remembered her, a small pouch of herb seeds she'd been carrying for 3 years, waiting to plant them somewhere permanent. She unpacked the seeds last and held them for a moment, and then she went down to the kitchen garden and dug a bed in the corner Hale had identified along the east fence and put them in the ground. Hale came out while she was finishing and looked at the new bed with the proprietary interest of a person who considered the garden his domain. "What are those?" he asked. "Herbs," she said. "Mostly. There's some medicinal in there, something for fever, something for stomach ailments. Clara's sage is already growing along the fence, but these will fill in the gaps." Hale crouched and looked at the disturbed soil seriously. "How long before they come up?" 3 weeks for the first shoots, depending on rain. He nodded, mentally incorporating this into his garden management plan, which had become genuinely sophisticated over the past months. He'd started keeping notes, a small book he'd found in the house, half filled with old supply lists that he'd repurposed for garden records. Yields, planting dates, what the soil needed, what grew well near what. She'd found him writing in it one evening and had looked over his shoulder without comment, and what she'd seen was not a boy playing at something, but a person developing a real skill. "I want to put in winter crops this year," he said. "Root vegetables, maybe some winter greens. If we plan it right, we could have fresh food through most of the cold months." We'd need to build cold frames, she said, glass or oilcloth over wooden frames to keep the frost off. He looked up. Can we? Do you have wood? He thought. There's lumber from when they repaired the south barn, some left over. Then yes, she said. We can. He stood up and brushed the dirt off his knees and looked at the garden. His garden now, genuinely, with an expression she recognized because she'd seen versions of it before. It was the expression of a person who has found the thing they're good at and the thing they love and discovered they're the same thing and is in the early stages of understanding what that means for the rest of their life. She was 13 years old when she'd felt it for the first time, standing in a kitchen and understanding instinctively how heat moved through metal and how salt changed a thing and how the timing of every step connected to every other step. She had spent 20 years building a life on that understanding, sometimes badly, sometimes alone, always moving. She did not begrudge the moving. It had made her who she was, and who she was had gotten her here. But she was glad to be here. Callum turned 16 in October, which arrived with a cold snap that put frost on the ground 2 weeks earlier than usual and sent the boys scrambling for their winter coats in the way boys always scrambled, with great drama and much uncertainty about where coats had gone since last winter. Mara made a cake. Not because it was her habit. She was not a person who had celebrated birthdays with any particular attention, but because she'd found in the months of living inside this family that the small rituals were the structural elements, the things that marked time and made it mean something, that said, this day is different from other days in a way that accumulated over years into the texture of a life. Clara had been a keeper of those rituals she'd gathered, the birthday cakes, the bread for special occasions, the way she'd sat on the back porch in the evenings. The boys knew what they'd lost partly through the absence of those specific things. She was not trying to restore what they'd lost. She'd been deliberate about that, and Silas had understood it. And somewhere along the way, the boys had understood it too, in the way that children understood things. Not consciously, but in the way the body understood balance. She was doing it because Callum was 16, and he'd held this family together through the worst of it, and nobody had made him a cake in a year, and it seemed like a simple and obvious thing to do. He came in from the barn in the late afternoon and stopped in the kitchen doorway, looking at the cake on the table with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Unguarded, young, briefly, and completely 16 years old. "Who made that?" he said. "The cake fairy," said Dodd, from the corner where he was supposed to be shelling beans and had mostly been watching the frosting situation develop. Callum looked at Mara. "Sit down," she said. He sat. The other boys materialized from their various locations throughout the house with the radar that children had for sugar and occasion. Silas came in from outside, saw the scene, and went to wash his hands without being told. They were crowded around the kitchen table in the October cold with the fire going and the lamp lit early because the days were shorter now. All 9 of them, 7 boys in descending order of size, Silas at the head of the table, Mara at the other end, and Callum looked around the table at his family and then at his cake and then down at the table, jaw working with the effort of not showing how much it mattered. "Say something," Dodd said helpfully. "Shut up, Dodd," said Hale. "I'm just saying, Bess." "Both of you," Mara said, not loud. They subsided. Callum looked up. He looked at his father and then at Mara, and his voice when it came was rough at the edges in a way he didn't try to smooth out. "Thank you," he said. "All of you." A pause. "I know this year was—" He stopped, shook his head. "I'm glad we're still here." Silas looked at his oldest son across the table. "So am I," he said. Simple, direct, the way he'd learned to say true things. Pem, who had been waiting with the patience of someone who has located the correct moment, said, "Can we have cake now?" The table laughed, all of them, ragged and real, the laugh of people who have been through something hard together and come out the other side still capable of it. Winter settled over Blackstone Reach in its deliberate way, and the ranch settled into the routines of the cold season. The cattle were moved to the winter pasture, the garden put to bed with Hale's cold frames protecting the last of the greens, the woodpile built up to a height that Silas pronounced adequate, and Mara privately thought was slightly ambitious, but didn't say so because sometimes people needed to feel ready for winter in order to face it. Callum began riding into Copper Hill twice a week to study with a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Vance, who had agreed to prepare him for an examination at the regional education office. Mara had raised this possibility one evening, and Silas had been quiet for a long time, and then said he'd thought about it but hadn't known how to make it work. And she'd said that it worked by rearranging the morning chores so Callum could leave by 7 and return by afternoon, which was a logistics problem, not a philosophical one. Silas had looked at her with that expression she'd come to know well, the one that was part exasperation and part something warmer, and agreed. Callum had not said much when they told him. He'd gone very still in the way he went still when something mattered, and then he'd said he'd think about whether he wanted to, and the next morning he'd been up at 5 redistributing his share of the morning chores to Hale and Dodd, with the precision of a young man who had already decided and was moving directly to implementation. He was smart. She had known it from the first day, from the way he'd read the broker situation before she'd fully assembled it herself. What he needed was not intelligence. He had plenty, but access. A frame to put the intelligence inside. She thought about what that access might open for him and found she couldn't see the ceiling of it, which was a good sign. Hale, 16 months younger, was finding his own access in the garden and increasingly in the kitchen, where he'd begun appearing on weekend mornings to learn. He was not a natural cook. He overcorrected on seasoning and was impatient with timing, but he had the right instincts about ingredients and he paid attention, which was more than could be said for most people who tried to learn. Dodd, at 11, remained a force of nature who was best managed through direction rather than instruction. She'd learned to give him specific, concrete tasks with clear outcomes. Fix this section of fence, stack this wood to this height, get these eggs without breaking more than 2, and he executed them with a focused energy that, properly channeled, was genuinely useful. Fergus at 10 was the thinker, the one who asked why about everything and needed the answer before he'd commit. He'd started following Silas around the property, asking questions about the land, how the soil changed across the property, why the south pasture grew better than the north, what the rock formations along the creek ridge meant about the water table. Silas, she'd noticed, had started answering him differently than he'd answered the boys before, with less impatience, more detail, the answering of a father who had learned that his children's questions were worth the time they took. Theo continued to be himself, interior, observant, present in his particular quiet way. He'd started drawing, she'd discovered, small sketches in the margins of an old account book, images of the ranch from different angles, the windmill, the creek, the cattle in the south pasture. She'd said nothing to him about it, but she'd found a proper sketchbook in Copper Hill and left it on his bed without a note. And the next morning, he'd come to breakfast with it under his arm and had given her a look that communicated something complex and appreciative that he would not have been able to put into words and didn't try to. Jeb and Pem were still just Jeb and Pem, 6 and 5, the gravitational center of chaos in any room they occupied, in ways that had ceased to be crises and had become simply the weather of the household. The news about Cray and Garrett came in December in a letter from Estes. The county had completed its review. Aldous Cray had been found to have misrepresented his authority in at least 4 land transactions in the region over 18 months, 2 of which had resulted in families losing property they should not have lost. He faced a formal legal complaint and his association with the Millhaven Bank had been terminated. Garrett, who had been operating in a gray area, his broker activities technically legal even when they were predatory, had been formally barred from operating in 3 counties, including theirs, based on the pattern of collaboration with Cray that the county had documented. Fosker had cooperated with the review and had personally offered modest compensation to the 2 families who'd lost property, which didn't fix what had been broken, but was at least evidence that some men, confronted with the consequences of inattention, chose to face them. Silas read the letter at the kitchen table in the morning, folded it carefully, and set it down. "It's done then," he said. "Mostly," Mara said. "The families who lost property still have to rebuild." "Yes." He looked in the folded letter. "I know. I've been thinking about that. The Pellman family, north of Copper Hill, they were one of the 2. I know Ned Pellman. We weren't close, but we were neighbors in the way that matters out here." He paused. "I was thinking about whether there's something we could do. Not charity. Ned wouldn't take charity. But a fair arrangement, some work exchange maybe, or an arrangement on feed costs next season." She looked at him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "That's a good idea. Do it." He almost smiled. You don't have to sound surprised. I'm not surprised, she said. She considered. I'm glad you thought of it. He looked at her for a moment, and the almost smile became an actual one, rare enough still that she noticed it each time. You've been telling me for months that the community around us matters, he said, that it's not just the ranch, it's what the ranch is part of. I've been listening. You've been listening selectively, she said. Yes, well, he picked up his coffee. I'm working on it. Spring came late that year, but it came well. Steady rain through March, the kind that soaked in and stayed rather than running off. And by April, the West Field had the particular dark richness of soil that had been properly watered after a hard previous year and was ready to do its work. The planting was a whole ranch operation. Silas and the hired hand, a steady older man named Cord, who'd come to them in February on Doc Renner's recommendation, worked the West Field with the plow. Callum, home from his studies for the planting week, managed the seed allocation with the organized precision of a person who had been thinking about it since January. Hale ran the kitchen garden expansion with Theo as his assistant, a pairing that worked surprisingly well, Haley's enthusiasm and Theo's patience meeting in the middle. Mara worked everywhere, which was her habit. She was not a person who managed from a distance. She'd never learned how, and she was not sure she wanted to. She was in the field helping with the seed rows in the morning, and in the kitchen at midday, and in the garden in the afternoon. And at the end of the day, she was tired in the specific way that was the other side of doing something real, the tiredness that felt like something rather than nothing. On the second day of planting, Dodd and Jeb managed to have an argument in the middle of the West Field that ended with Dodd throwing a handful of seed at Jeb's head, which scattered a week's worth of oat seed across 15 feet of freshly turned earth. Mara, who witnessed this from the other side of the field, walked over without hurrying, looked at the scattered seed on the ground, looked at both boys and said, "Pick it up." "All of it?" said Jeb. "Everyone," she said. "You have an hour before the soil dries." She walked back to her row. Behind her, she heard the sounds of two boys on their knees in the dirt performing the tedious arithmetic of retrieving one seed at a time, and she thought that there were worse educations. Silas appeared beside her. He'd seen it from the far end of the field. "That'll take them an hour," he said. "I know. It actually might be more efficient than—" "The efficiency is not the point," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Right," he said. "Yes." He went back to his row. The field got planted. The seeds went in. The West Field, which had been cattle pasture for 40 years, took them without complaint. It was Pem who asked the question. On an April evening, when the light was going long and gold over the fields and the new growth was just showing in the West Field and the kitchen garden was green and busy and the ranch looked like what it had always been and also like something more than it had been, both at once. He found Mara on the back porch, her evening habit now, the same spot Clara had used, which she had come to without planning, drawn by the view and the quiet. And he climbed up beside her with the practiced ease of a 6-year-old who had done this many times and settled his small weight against her arm. "Are you happy?" he asked, with the directness that 6-year-olds reserved for the questions adults spent years avoiding. She looked at the fields, at the West Field's fine green haze of first growth, at the garden where Hale's cold frames had been replaced by full summer beds, at the new well with its proper stone coping, at the barn roof that Dodd and Fergus had shingled badly and then shingled again properly, at the fence lines that were sound, at the windmill that turned without squealing. She thought about what she knew of happiness, which was not as much as she'd wanted to know at 34, and not as little as she'd feared. She knew it was not a steady state. It came in windows, in specific moments, in the space between one hard thing and the next. She knew it was more durable when it was attached to something real rather than something imagined. She knew it looked different from the inside than it looked from the outside, and that the inside version was quieter and less dramatic and more like this. A porch, an evening, a child's weight against your arm, the sound of the ranch settling into itself at the end of the day. She also knew, in a way she could not have articulated easily, but felt with the clarity of something long tested, that the version of herself who had arrived at this ranch with $2.60 and one night's agreement had been a person organized around leaving. and that organizing yourself around leaving was a way of surviving, and survival was not a small thing, and she did not regret what it had taken to get here. But she was here now. "Yes," she said to Pym. "I am." He nodded, as though this confirmed what he'd already known, and leaned his head more fully against her arm. Behind them, the door opened and Theo appeared, then Hale, and she heard Silas's voice inside directing Dodd toward some task, and the particular organized noise of this household at the end of a day, arguments and laughter and boots on floorboards and the fire and the smell of whatever was still warm in the kitchen, flowed out through the open door into the evening air and settled around the porch like something solid. She had spent 10 years moving through other people's homes. She had cooked in kitchens that were not hers and slept in rooms that would always belong to someone else and left before she could become part of the furniture. She had told herself this was freedom, and parts of it were. The parts where she had not had to answer to anyone, the parts where she could leave a bad situation without anything holding her. Those parts were real, and she would not pretend otherwise. But freedom, she had come to understand, was not the same as belonging. And belonging, which she had avoided with considerable skill for a long time, turned out to be not the trap she had feared, but the thing that made the other things, the work, the difficulty, the ordinary, irreducible weight of daily life, mean something beyond their own immediate fact. The hard truth, the one she'd been arriving at for months, and had finally arrived at without ceremony, was this. A woman could spend a lifetime being careful not to need anyone, and the caution could keep her safe in the short term and hollow in the long one. She had been careful, she had been hollow in ways she hadn't fully admitted. And then she had put a bag down in a corner and something had changed. Not all at once, not dramatically, not in any way that made a good story from the outside, but in the slow, irreversible way that real changes happened, grain by grain, day by day, until one morning you woke up and found that the person you'd been was still in you, but was no longer running things. Silas came out onto the porch. He stood beside her and looked at the field and put his hand, briefly, over hers where it rested on the railing. Not a statement, not a gesture toward anything dramatic, just a man and a woman at the end of a day, standing on a porch that had been one person's for a long time, and was now, in the unremarkable and complete way of things that finally settle, theirs. "Westfield looks good," he said. "It does," she said. Pym, between them, said nothing, which was unusual enough that she looked down at him and found he'd fallen asleep against her arm with the total commitment that small children brought to sleeping, completely out, one boot on, one bare foot, as he had always been and probably always would be. Silas looked at his youngest son and something moved across his face. Not grief this time, or not only grief. Something older and more complicated that she understood was the way the people we've lost stayed with us in the faces of the people we're still raising. Clara Boone was in this porch, and in this garden, and in these boys, and in the bread she'd put away for special occasions. She was not gone, not entirely, not in the ways that mattered. She had built something that had survived her, which was all any of us could ask of the time we were given. "I'll take him up," Silas said, and lifted Pym carefully, the boy's head settling against his shoulder without waking. She watched them go inside. She stood on the porch alone for a moment in the last of the evening light, the enormous sky over Blackstone Reach going dark at the edges, stars beginning at the horizon the way they always began out here, first one and then many and then too many to count. The windmill turned in the night wind. The Westfield held its breath. She had arrived at this place with almost nothing, which was how she had always traveled. She was leaving with nothing either, nothing she could put in a bag, nothing portable, nothing that could be carried on the road south. She was not leaving. That was the point. The bag was upstairs in the room at the end of the hall, and it was empty. The things that had been in it were in drawers, on shelves, in the ground, dispersed throughout this household so thoroughly that packing them back would take longer than she wanted to spend. She was 34 years old, and she had been, by any honest measure, late to the realization that the life she'd been looking for was not something she'd find by moving toward it. It was something she'd find by stopping, by staying in the difficulty long enough for the difficulty to become something else. Not easy, not resolved into perfection, but real, inhabited, hers. The first star above Blackstone Reach held steady in the deepening sky, and below it the ranch lights came on one by one as the boys went to their rooms, and the house settled into its nightly self, and Mara Quinn stood on the back porch of the place where she lived and breathed the cold spring air and felt the full, plain, ordinary weight of a life that was going to continue tomorrow and the day after that, demanding and imperfect and difficult and genuinely irreversibly hers. She went inside. She did not look back at the road.